In this video, we're going to take a look at how to create surfaces procedurally using Substance Designer or Adobe Substance 3D. This will be a three-part video, and by the end of it, you will understand the basics of procedural texturing and how to replicate complex surfaces by breaking them down into simple shapes and patterns. You'll also understand how to create a high-quality mesh from your procedural texture. What we first want to think about when creating things procedurally is the benefits that will give us. When we create something procedurally, we should be able to adjust and get different variations of that surface very easily, as well as tile it in different ways or change its distribution. So those are things we want to keep in mind. We also want to make sure we produce high quality normal maps as well as displacement and height maps for additional detail. In addition to that, we should also create some detailed matching geometry so that the texture has supporting geometric detail for uses in future technologies like Unreal's Nanite or for very close-up use in film. When looking at a surface, normal people just focus on what they see right away. They don't really think about anything else. It's just an initial reaction to that surface. And then maybe they'll start looking at color and kind of what details there are. But right away, they don't really think about anything else. When you're kind of trained to create procedural surfaces and you kind of have that mentality, you need to start thinking a little bit differently. When I see a surface, I don't just see my initial impression of that surface. What I actually start to see is more things like structure, shape, and size. When I look at a surface like this, and this is one of those kind of anti-slip floors that you would kind of find by a SkyTrain or a subway, so that people don't end up slipping when it gets cold and icy or wet. So looking at this surface and trying to replicate it, the first thing I kind of focus on right away is what shapes do I see? What patterns do I see? I don't focus on anything else aside from what those patterns are, what those shapes are, and how they're distributed. So I see circles, I see squares, I see the spacing in between those two different shapes, and then I see some other kind of grunge or damaged areas of this or dirt stuck into it in kind of these other kind of more organic forms, almost like a noise or additional grunge on top. So I start to focus on those different details and surfaces and how they're kind of broken up in different areas. Now, when looking at the surface as well, we see that there are those circles, those little bumps that kind of pop out of the surface, and then in between them, there's a bit of an empty space or a space where there's no circle. And it's kind of alternating. There's a circle and then this empty square space, circle, empty square space. And it kind of repeats that pattern. And that pattern right away I recognize as kind of like a checkerboard pattern. So already I have a plan to create this surface. I can have circles and squares distributed in the pattern of a checkerboard. And that already gives me the recipe to build the overall structure of this surface. After I focus on the larger details, I start to look a little bit closer and focus on the smaller details. How many of those tiny little circles are inside one of those blank sections that have a square? Here I can see there's 7 rows and 7 columns of those tiny little circles or grips in between the larger circles. And the larger circles also have bumps or details on them as well. So after I focus on the larger shapes, I'll start working my way down to the smaller shapes. And I find that's always a more successful way to work. Figure out the large shapes, the large patterns first, and then work your way down to the details. So we can start creating the surface. We're going to jump into Substance Designer or Adobe Substance 3D and start to produce this surface. So I already have my texture reference loaded in here just in case if we have to refer back to it. I have it here so I can easily just pull it up. And what we're going to start taking a look at is creating this actual surface in Substance Designer. So I'm going to go up here to File, create a new Substance graph. I'll make it a PBR metallic roughness graph. I'll call it SBS underscore anti-slip surface. I'll make it a 4K map, and that is okay. So now I have all my inputs for base color, normals, roughness, metallic, ambient, occlusion, height. I don't care. I'm not going to use those. I'm just going to focus on creating the shapes first. I'll come back to those later. I don't worry about those at all. So first thing we want to do is create those patterns that we need to create when looking at our reference. So I need to create those circles. I need to create the gap in between, which is a bunch of other circles kind of tiled out in 7 rows and 7 columns. So let's start creating those shapes. So I need a disk or a circle or something to create that shape. So I'm going to go in here and just create a shape node. That shape will be a disk. So I have my disk. Now, if I need that other pattern, it's just a bunch of these tiled. So I'll copy and paste that shape and tile it 7 by 7 times. And there we go. I got my tiled pattern. So now I'll take both these, I'll put them into a frame. That way I can keep things organized, and I'll call this base patterns or shapes, whatever we want to call it. And that way it'll just save me a bit of time in the long run. I don't get lost in my own graphs as easily if I start to group things. Now we need to distribute these. So it's kind of in that distribution that we talked about where it looks like a checkerboard. It's alternating from one pattern to the next. So I'm going to create a tile sampler. That will let me tile the shape. So I'll put this into this circle into pattern 1, pattern input 1. On that tile sampler, I'll scroll down and set the pattern to be the inputted pattern. I want more than one pattern, so I'll set the pattern input number to 2, and then also put in the other pattern to pattern input number 2. And now I get this weird distribution that looks like this, kind of looks like a maze, but doesn't look like what I want. So I now need to have a distribution map to show how to distribute these two shapes. By default, the pattern input distribution is set to random. We're going to change it to distribution map. We're going to go down to where it says distribution map here, pattern distribution map input, and I'll connect that to a checker. Now what the problem is the areas, if I look at this checker, the areas that are pretty much white get ignored and don't actually display this other shape. So what I'm just going to do to fix this, probably other ways we can fix this, like a clamp or levels or something. I'm just going to throw in a levels and clamp the white value just to be a little bit lower. And by doing that, there we go. Now it's distributing our pattern. So we start to have the same pattern we see on our reference here. Circle, square, circle, square. And then if we look at what we have here, circle, square, circle, square. So not perfect. Maybe the spacing's a little bit off, but we have something that gives us a good start. And then maybe I'll also put this into a frame and call that distribution map. Or distribution maps, whatever. Okay, so we started to produce what we need to make. Now, the only problem is we probably want to adjust this a little bit, or maybe even add like a frame or some sort of pattern around it if we had bricks or something else. So that's something you could do after this next node here. We won't worry about that, but you could definitely do that. We need to start focusing on the details. So what about these circles here? We need to start adding the patterns or the details that go inside one of these circles. So when I look at the reference, there is a bunch of little circles in the center of that shape. So we need to start creating those. And they're kind of more of a diamond-like shape. Again, recognizing shapes and patterns. So it's like a diamond-like shape. So you can see right here, it's like I'll draw a different color. It's like a diamond. So I'm going to start making that shape. Maybe what I'll do is create another shape pattern. Sure, it can be a square this time. Maybe I'll rotate it. So I'll go in here and rotate it by like a 45-degree angle. I should be able to rotate this. Let's see. It's too large, so I'll pull the scale down. There we go. 45? No. 90. Something. Some angle. Let's see. 0 is like this. Oh, I see how it's going. Okay, so we have to rotate it. Degrees I want to rotate, not turns. What kind of wacky system is this? There we go, 45 degrees. And now I got that. I'll blend that, so I'll drag that out, blend it. Probably put this into foreground, not background, so I'll just disconnect that. My background will be those little dots kind of in there, so what I'll do is another shape node. I'll do a disk, scale it down a bit, tile it maybe how many times? I don't know, like looking at it. Let's go back to the reference. It could be like 7, but I don't know if I really feel like counting. But let's see, 3, 6, 7, 8. Okay, something like that. So maybe I'll tile it by 8 or 10 times. So maybe just do 10. And that should be good. So now I have those patterns. Maybe I need a bit more spacing on here. It seems like they're too big. So I'll just pull the scale down a bit more and just kind of eyeball it for now. I think that's good. And then for the blend, let's change these blend modes, probably do something like a multiply kind of works. Now I don't want it to cut off these circles at the edge. There might be a more elegant way to figure that out, but what I'm probably just going to do is go in here and change the tiling till it doesn't cut it off. So I could do something like maybe 9.5. Oops, this can't do 9.5. I could do like 10, and then I can go to the shape here and just change the scale, just so it doesn't cut them off. There we go. That looks good. Now I got that diamond shape. So now what we want to do is get some nice kind of fall off on them. I still see a little bit of an edge here that I forgot to put that scale. There we go. Oh, now it's cutting off that edge. Again, there's probably a better way to do this if you put a little bit more effort into it, but I'm just going to do this and just solve that little issue. I can just make these scales a little bit smaller. There we go. No more problems. Okay, so I want a bit of a fall off on them now because they're very hard shapen and kind of cut out. So what I'll end up doing is maybe adding something like a edge detect to grab the edges like this. And I can play with that width and the edge roundness and just kind of get a circular edge. And again, we see a little bit of a shape there. I'm just going to change the scale of these to compensate for that. There we go. No more problems. And I'll add another blend. Put that edge in the foreground, this shape in the background. And for blend mode, maybe what I'll do is I'll go through here, find something that gives me a nice little kind of edge on it, where it kind of expands it. So now what I'm doing is I'm making it larger, but I also have a mask for the edges if I need it. So it's kind of working in two ways. This way, this edge detect can easily be a controller for me to make these larger without having to go back to my shape and cause all those other issues we talked about. And at the same time, it can also be used as a way to mask the edges for dirt, grunge, other things as well. So it's working kind of as a benefit in two ways. Now after this, I could add like a transform node or something to add this on top of this shape down here. But before doing that, I'll probably again frame this for now. Throw it into a frame and just give it a name, maybe like inset grip. There we go. So starting to build up the shapes. So now that I have that, I have to start adding the shape back on top of this here. So I'm going to shift this back, add a blend, throw this into the foreground, this into the background, and then take this, maybe subtract it away. There we go. Starting to get the shape. If I do have to change the sizing of it, you see it gets really close to the edge. But if we look at the reference, maybe it needs a bit more room. So what I will end up doing is adding a bit of a transform 2D. And I can just scale that down a bit, maybe like height and width stretch or scale, maybe like 65%. And then width, same thing, 65%. Okay, that's good. Don't want to tile it, so for tiling mode, I'll just go absolute and say instead of horizontal and vertical tiling, no tiling. There we go. So now it's just going to be in the center. There we go. So now we have that shape kind of done. So now if we look at everything, if we use this as our new pattern 1, and we take a look at everything together, okay, we're starting to build up that shape and pattern. It's starting to look more like what I expect it to be. Now, the distance between these is a little bit off. I need to kind of condense them a little bit more. So we need to start kind of closing this distance or this gap here. And the only way I can kind of start to do that is if I go through this tile sampler. I can have size. So you have like X and Y size, you can shrink them, but I can't really make them bigger. Now if I put this to 1.5, I could force it to be bigger. It's not going to let you scroll, but if you type in the number, you can override it. So I can do that and just put these both at 1.25, and now they're more condensely packed, and maybe that just solves my issue. So that could also be good. We could just do that. Maybe that's a bit too much, maybe 1.2. And then also what we can do is these seem too big. Let's go into that shape, put their scale lower. They have a little bit of a gap in between them. Should probably go take a look at the reference. Let's see what we got here. Oh yeah, they got a bit of a gap in between them. So come back in here, give them a little bit of a gap. There we go. Now we have our pattern. So now that we have our base pattern, we haven't even worried about color, normal maps, roughness, anything else. Doesn't matter at this point. All we're doing is blocking in the shapes. Now we have the basic large scale shapes and the outline of the small scale shapes as well. We have the circles, we have the kind of rows and columns of the smaller circles in between the larger circles. The larger circles have their grip or that little kind of bumpy diamond shaped circles in the center. So we have all the outlines for all the details there. Now we actually have to make those details properly toned in color wise, also shape wise. Right now they're almost like cutouts. They should have a much softer fall off. Right now they're just like a cutout, but it doesn't matter. We're just blocking in shape. So this is kind of our kind of recipe or blueprint to build the rest of the graph. Now that we have this, even building things later on, we can get a mask of anything we want here. The larger circles, the smaller circles, the tiny circles inside the bigger circle, the edge of those circles. We have all our masks and all our kind of structural shapes to modify from here going forward. So anything that changes here, tiling pattern, like if we want to tile it in a different pattern, we could change this checkerboard to something else and it would totally readjust. And since everything else later on is going to be based off the starting point, all these parameters here that we set could be adjustable and ripple down through the whole graph and make everything very procedurally modifiable. We'd be able to modify how these things are laid out, what shapes there. Maybe I don't want them to be circles. Maybe later on we want it to be a square. Well, I can go in here, make one single change it to a square, now everything's squares. So it can easily update your whole network if we use this as a base. So this is kind of where we'll leave it in part one. Part two, we'll start making these shapes come to life in 3D. And then our final step will be worrying about coloring and how they actually shade and respond to light. But first, we blocked out the shapes. Next, we'll focus on the shaping in 3D with our normal maps, displacement, and height maps. And then we'll focus on coloring them.